Доброго дня, шановні пани та пани. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this launch event. I'm very pleased to be with you. My name is Bill Thompson. I am the OECD Eurasia Division head, and I will be moderating this first session before the more detailed technical discussions take place. It's a very rich program, so I'm going to say nothing about the substance of the work being presented today. I simply want to make one or two important technical points. The most important is that you may choose interpretation using the interpretation menu in Zoom. You'll see a little globe icon which will allow you to choose. Zoom does not offer us Ukrainian as an option, so it says English or French, but we are reliably informed, and experience suggests that if you choose French, you will in fact get Ukrainian. Otherwise, you can stick with English or keep it off and hear both languages. And I remind all of the speakers participating that it is extremely helpful if you turn interpretation off when you yourself take the floor. If you are speaking with interpretation going, it can create some interference. And now Tanya Khavanska will repeat that for us in Ukrainian.
Thank you very much. I think that this is my one chance to speak Ukrainian, because then we will switch on to the interpreters. Доброго дня, шановні пані та панове. Для усіх україномовних учасників нашого сьогоднішнього.
Good afternoon, dear participants, all participants who are willing to use the Ukrainian language for today's event. You may select the globe icon. You will see two channels, English and French, but French will stand for Ukrainian. Both speakers and moderators, please turn off the interpretation channels while you're speaking, and you can also select between English or Ukrainian channels to listen to the interpretation. And we would like to ask the speakers and moderators to turn your cameras on while you are speaking. Thank you very much, and I wish you all of us lots of success.
I welcome you once again to the launch of the OECD Anti-Corruption Review of the Energy Sector in Ukraine. And without further ado, I'm very happy to pass the floor to the Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, Mr. Jeffrey Schlagenhauf.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to open the launch of the OECD Anti-Corruption Review of the Energy Sector in Ukraine. It is a pleasure to see such a strong turnout from Ukraine and the international community, including our OECD member countries. The report that will be presented today is part of a larger project on supporting energy sector reform in Ukraine, which was launched in 2019 and is coming to an end with today's event. I would like to thank the Norwegian government for its political and financial support and for entrusting the OECD with this important work. Ukraine's energy sector accounts for about 12.6% of GDP and is central for promoting Ukraine's economic and sustainable growth. A well-functioning energy sector, attractive to investors, and an enabler of economic activity will only be possible if anti-corruption reforms are implemented successfully. In recent years, Ukraine has undertaken important anti-corruption reforms. The creation of the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office, and the High Anti-Corruption Court have all contributed to effective prevention, detection, and prosecution of corrupt acts, including in the energy sector. However, these institutions often face challenges in carrying out their functions independently and without undue influence. Public decision processes often lack transparency, while the enforcement of many anti-corruption safeguards still meets resistance. The energy sector is no exception to this. The review we present today offers vital insights, as well as targeted and operational recommendations to close loopholes and improve anti-corruption practices in the Ukrainian energy sector. the National Agency on Corruption Prevention and the Ministry of Energy both supported the OECD throughout this work, and we are grateful to both. I thank the head of the agency and the minister for being here today, a sign of their commitment to this work. Tackling corruption requires coordinated and multifaceted strategies. The review reflects this reality and encourages Ukrainian stakeholders to make strategic decisions about how the energy sector is structured in a transparent, well-grounded, and evidence-based way, with due involvement of all relevant stakeholders, while explaining the rationale behind the political decisions. This will strengthen the trust and cooperation of all engaged parties. Two things that are both essential to build a corruption-free energy sector. Going forward, the report recommends that Ukraine adopt an anti-corruption strategy and complete a strategic corruption risk assessment of the energy sector and its subsectors. Finally, Ukraine could also focus on further improving its law enforcement responses to corruption in the energy sector, especially high-level corruption. This includes strengthening the operational capacities and expertise of investigators, prosecutors, and asset recovery officers to tackle complex cases in the energy sector. To succeed in facing corruption head-on, Ukraine's parliament, government, anti-corruption agencies, and the judiciary, as well as private and civil society stakeholders, will need to work together. Furthermore, reform efforts will only succeed with support from the public, the business community, and international partners. Today's agenda and its wide range of speakers provide a good template for the cooperation that will be needed going forward. Before closing, I want to thank the numerous Ukrainian stakeholders, including many present here today, who have supported the OECD in this exercise. Your input contributed to a robust and broad-based set of recommendations, which I am confident will contribute to building a level playing field in the energy sector and lifting living standards for Ukrainians. Let me assure you that the OECD will be at your side, supporting you through the framework of our Memorandum of Understanding as you continue the fight against corruption to build a future for Ukraine that is more just, more prosperous for all. I wish you a very fruitful discussion and every success in advancing these important reforms. Thank you for allowing me the privilege of joining you today. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Secretary General. And now I am very happy to pass the floor to the head of Ukraine's National Agency on Corruption Prevention, Mr. Alexander Novikov.
Пані та панове, колеги, друзі, всім доброго дня.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, good afternoon. I'm happy to represent the NACP at this event. Ukraine is a signee to the Istanbul Treaty on anti-corruption. As of now, the sustainable development of energy sector is the prerequisite for the national security of Ukraine, because the war initiated by our northern neighbor takes place in particular in the energy sector. Why is energy a security factor? Because the corruption in the energy sector before the revolutionary dignity has been a foundation for making impact on the decisions in the country. The issues of energy in the focus of the energy strategy adopted by the president. The findings of the review presented today are extremely crucial for both NACP and the government of Ukraine. I'm sure that this overview will become a reliable source of information providing comprehensive assessment on all issues related to corruption in the energy sector. The goal of these recommendations would be to achieve zero tolerance to corruption. Since 2013, the government of Ukraine delivered great job to reduce the level of corruption due to the structural reforms and changes of the rules. We highly appreciate the work done by the OECD representatives. We are sure that this work will contribute to the appropriate political decisions, and it will become possible to break the existing corruption practices which still persist. The systemic problems or challenges highlighted in the overview require the anti-corruption document, anti-corruption strategy, which would be a strategic document. It hasn't been adopted by the parliament yet. The strategy will provide answers to the questions of transparency in privatization process, stimulation of competition in energy markets due to enhancement of or reinforcement of anti-monopoly legislation. The legislation which is supposed to be adopted quite soon will also focus on the issue of whistleblowers, and hopefully the problem with Artem and with the dismissal of one of its whistleblowers will be resolved in the nearest future. Hopefully that the court will also put a full stop to the story with the appointment of Naftogaz ahead. The strategic analysis of corruption risks will become actually the basics for the profound analysis of all corruption risks. We cooperate with the public authorities. We're going to continue our cooperation in terms of the development of primary and secondary legislation. A week ago, the NACP adopted the standard anti-corruption program for all legal entities, which regulates the issues of anti-corruption in the energy sector completely differently. We are going to contribute to train the anti-corruption officers as recommended in the overview. Apart from some challenges, Ukraine is moving towards minimization of corruption risks, which is proved by the opinions of the experts. So we see that Ukraine is committed to the reduction of the corruption rate. We agree that corruption is a threat to the energy sector. We are urging all the stakeholders to consolidate their efforts in order to overcome corruption. Hopefully that today's discussion will contribute to zero tolerance of corruption in the energy sector. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Novikov, very much. Finally, we turn to Norway, whose generosity has made this very important work possible. I'm very happy to hand the floor to Ms. Alexandra Vatsko, Counselor and Deputy Head of Mission in the Royal Norwegian Embassy in Kiev.
Thank you, William, and good afternoon, everyone. So let me start by thanking you for inviting me to say a few words on this important launch on this anti-corruption review of the energy sector in Ukraine. And I view this as an important component of the OECD project related to the energy sector reform, where Norway is providing financial support, as already been mentioned. And the main object of this project is to support the government of Ukraine's effort to reform corporate governance in the energy sector in alignment with OECD standards and the EU's third energy package. And allow me to use this opportunity to say a few words on Norway's support in Ukraine. Norway supports the Ukraine and its people. to integrate further into Euro-Atlantic structure, both politically and practically. Since 2014, we have contributed more than 170 million euros to a large number of development projects in Ukraine. And we focus on areas where we believe Norway can add most value. So energy sector is such, and we have, during the last couple of years, stepped up our support for Ukraine's energy sector reform. We are a major donor in project aimed at increasing energy efficiency, promoting corporate governance within the energy sector, enhancing nuclear safety, just to give you a few examples. And a well-functioning energy sector is an important component for economic development in general, and has huge impact on other sectors as well. The ongoing energy crisis in Europe is a clear reminder of the importance energy sector has for society as a whole. And as you most probably already know, corruption remains one of the most pressing issues in Ukraine. As confirmed by the latest ranking in the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International, Ukraine ranked 170 out of 180 countries. And corruption wears down the society fabric while impacting the investment climate and international cooperation, which are paramount for the energy sector development. An energy corruption institution isn't enough in this battle. A change of culture where civil servants play a paramount role is needed. And as OECD's review confirms, tackling corruption requires coordinated and multilateral solution where transparency and evidence-based decisions are needed. And as already mentioned by others today, Ukraine has already taken several positive reform steps in general and within the scope of this project. And I would like to congratulate Ukraine on your continued commitment to successful completion of this complex set of reforms. And as we know, reforms isn't an easy task, especially not in challenging times. However, a number of further steps needed to be taken in order to release the full potential of a reformed energy sector. And I would like to highlight the importance of tackling corruption, ensuring the management of state-owned companies in line with OECD guidelines, and creating a level playing field in energy market. And investments are without a doubt essential to ensure sustainable development of the energy sector of Ukraine. However, in order to achieve this, Ukraine needs to convince energy companies and investors not only that there are great business opportunities in Ukraine, but also that this country is safe, transparent, and predictable country to invest in. And as we have seen, for example, in renewable energy sector here, this unfortunately isn't the case, where we have seen reactive measures, debts, and government not only honoring their commitments. And I, for example, am familiar with several renewable energy companies, including Norwegian Scatec and Emergy, who has been forced to halt the project and further investments in Ukraine due to this grave situation. And I think that in this context, it's worth mentioning that IMF now requires that the Ukrainian government ensures full payment to the renewable energy producers, which could be a good sign and could contribute to settle this debt issue. And then another aspect is the need of real market reforms, a wish expressed by investors, which could again contribute to less corruption in the energy sector and allow more market players to get on board. So the project that the OECD is implementing with Norwegian support plays an important role in that regard. Aligning the energy sector with OECD standards and practices sends an important signal to possible investors. Hopefully the review's recommendation and its implementation will precisely have this effect. Finally, I would like to say that Norway is delighted to be OECD's partner in this project. And I truly believe that strong partnership of Ukraine, Norway, and OECD has the potential to secure reforms that would benefit generations to come. So let me end up by underlining that Norway remains committed to supporting Ukraine's reform efforts bilaterally, as well together with other partners, so as the OECD. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for those words. I especially appreciate the way you set the work that is under discussion today, which is very important, into the larger context of that overall project, which Norway has been supporting, because of course, all of the different elements of this are connected, and they are all part of creating a better and more sustainable energy sector and a better and more sustainable future for Ukraine's citizens. That brings us to the end of the opening remarks. The rest of the agenda, as you will see, is organized around the crucial building blocks of the review, first looking at risks in the energy sector, then looking naturally at anti-corruption measures in the energy sector to address those and to address the challenges that arise. And finally, there will be a session on investigation and prosecution. So for the discussion of corruption risks in the sector, I'm happy to pass over to my colleague in the OECD Eurasia division, the country manager for Ukraine, Ms. Gabriela Miranda.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, colleagues. Good afternoon in Kiev. Good morning in the United States, Canada, and welcome everyone to this event. My pleasure to be here. As you heard, this review is the last of a series that have been prepared by the OECD in the context of this Norway-funded project. And we are very happy that this concludes with a cherry on the cake of the work, because of course we understand that all that has to do with the transformation of the sector from reforming the state-owned companies to attracting investments and addressing competition issues, among others, have to do with addressing corruption. So this is today a very important work that I'm very happy that my colleagues concluded with great success, I must say. It's a fascinating study, and I hope it's going to be a relevant one as well. As you know, the energy sector was identified as one of the 5 top areas susceptible to corruption risks by the National Agency for Corruption Prevention, and will be the second area to be looked at in depth by this lead anti-corruption policy and prevention agency of Ukraine. So we hope really that this review will be a prosecutor of this work, and we hope that it will serve also as a good analytical basis for states analysis and also for addressing and implementing our recommendations. This first session will cover the first 2 chapters of the report that is now available in English and will be soon available in Ukrainian. These first 2 chapters that cover corruption risks in the energy sector and the key recommendations to prevent corruption in the energy sector. So the main presentation will be made by our senior expert, Mr. Valts Kalnins. Thank you very much for being here, who will present both the assessments and the recommendations, and it will be followed by a panel discussion with distinguished guests from, as you saw, Deputy Minister of Energy, our colleagues from EBRD, very important players in Ukraine in the energy sector and in corruption as well, and also a colleague from the State Property Fund of Ukraine. So without further ado, let me pass the floor to Mr. Valts Kalnins for the first presentation. Please, Valts.
Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to be able to present this study, which I will do in a very concise way. I have had the overall responsibility for the preparation of this report, but of course, together with a large, very competent team for whose cooperation and all kinds of assistance, I'm very, very much thankful. And I'm also very, very much thankful to all the counterparts in Ukraine who helped with their responses to our requests and with explanations and answers to our questions, without which this work would not be possible. I hope the presentation is well visible. If not, please tell me immediately. I will go through the main subsectors that we analyze in our report. And the first of those is the oil and gas sector. And in this sector, we identify, as in all sectors, many different kinds of risks. But one of the key issues here are risks which are produced by state regulation of the market without being able to consistently ensure fair reliable treatment of all participants in the market, which has resulted in different kinds of risks of abuse of price regulations, abuse of subsidies, also manipulations of consumption of gas, for example, because of different barriers to reliable metering and monitoring of their consumption. And also there are a number of other more specific risks related to the unbundling of suppliers of gas and operators of distribution networks, and so on and so forth. In the oil market, we identified a number of risks related to, we could say, gray economy of the oil market, and also trends of monopolization in the sales and purchases of oil from state producers. Yes. So the next one is nuclear power. I'm sorry, I double-clicked on my slides. And we see that in the area of nuclear power, the most acute risks that we have identified based on public information largely are risks related to procurement, all kinds of abuse, kickbacks, bribery, embezzlement, also the activity of what we could call predatory intermediaries, which require state or state-owned actors to pay more for supplies and receive less for selling their products. There are also instances of cartels in the procurement area, and also risks, as of course on all sectors to some extent, risks in the managerial activity, internal abuse within state-owned entities. In the coal sector, actually, and this is an interesting observation, we look at quite different subsectors, nuclear and coal, but we see that key risks are actually very similar. In the coal sector, it is also the procurement and all kinds of abuse in procurement, which are a key area of risk.
I think we've lost your presentation, but we're going to present it, so it's easier for you. You just have to tell us when to put the slides. Would be perhaps easier.
Okay.
Yes, it's back on again. So tell us. Yeah, I think we're in the.
Yeah, code. I'm sorry.
Perfect. Now it's all good. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and so basically, the risks, the types of risks that we identify are quite similar in nuclear and coal subsectors. Next, please. Hydropower. Hydropower is also, as all of them, a very specific subsector. And we know both from the international experience and also based on concerns that have been voiced in Ukraine, that sometimes it is the strategic development decisions of what power plants will be built where, with what impact on the environment, with what impact on the people who live in the affected areas, are often issues of concern, topics of concern, and also there are also often risks involved that certain strategic decisions could be made under impact of some corrupt personal interests. This is not a claim that in Ukraine this has necessarily happened, but it indicates a certain area where risks can be anticipated and to which attention has to be paid. Of course, as in most areas where state-owned enterprises work and where public institutions are involved, again, we have the procurement risks, even though in the hydro sector, they are actually, the publicly reported incidents are somewhat fewer than in some other areas. But there are also allegations we have seen regarding possible mismanagement, and there are tensions between the CEO, the main CEO in state-owned enterprise in this area, and the government, which is of course a longer story, which is described in certain detail in the report. And also a very specific area of risk in the hydropower is associated with small power plants, so where certain local conflicts of interest, etc., may have an impact. Next, please. The renewable sector. The renewable sector is, of course, very new, much newer than all the other sectors. But a key area of concern in the renewable sector has been related to different confrontations of interests regarding support to renewable production of energy or production from renewable sources. And also, of course, this goes both for the development of the support system in the first place, and then also related to the resolution of the situation with the debts and inefficiencies that we have in this support scheme in Ukraine. There are concerns regarding localization schemes as an entry barrier for outside investors, and also certain risks associated with support to small ground-mounted solar installations, and of course a certain block of concerns about potential risk associated with the auctioning scheme as a support mechanism, which is going to be used in Ukraine in the sector of renewables. Next, please. Thank you. So you will see in our full report, which is very detailed and extensive, there are also topics, other topics that we look at, areas that we look at in depth into the electricity transmission system operator and distribution system operators and associated risks in this area. We look separately on privatization, on public procurement, because it's such a very, very big risk area, licensing and permits, and electricity markets. Next, please. We have proposed a large number of recommendations in our study. These recommendations that I'm going to show now on screen are just some very general ones, which cover the whole area of the energy sector. There are many more detailed recommendations in the report. And when we talk about these key general recommendations, one block of the recommendations focuses on the policy making, on the way strategic decisions regarding the sector are made. And they, of course, should be made in a transparent, well-grounded, and evidence-based manner. And we are also cautioning against adopting special legislation regarding emergency situations. Well, of course, the most acute ongoing emergency situation is related to the COVID-19 pandemic. But it is important to ensure that also exceptions, when they are made, are clearly grounded and guarantee competition, transparency, and accountability. Next, please. So another block of recommendations concerns competition and procurement. An overarching issue in many of the subsectors are limitations to competition, and limitations of competition provide fertile grounds for corruption opportunities. And we also recommend that as much as possible, the public procurement is carried out in line with the provisions of the law on public procurement, and with no exceptions, unless it is clearly grounded why certain exceptions must exist. And still, even then, competition, transparency, and accountability shall be ensured. Next, please. Then a large area of recommendations refer to SOEs, state-owned enterprises, regarding corporatization, governance reforms in line with best practices, including OECD guidelines on corporate governance of SOEs and the guidelines on anti-corruption and integrity in SOEs. We really would like to stress the recommendation that it is necessary to ensure that no arbitrary political or administrative interference in SOEs is possible. And it is important to uphold the legal guarantees for anti-corruption officers, compliance officers, and whistleblowers in SOEs. And the social responsibilities and goals, in whatever ways they are applied to SOEs, must be defined clearly. The costs of them must be calculated realistically, and they also should be clearly taken into account in the performance appraisal of the SOEs. Next, please. And this is the last substantive slide. And this shows the block of recommendations concerning debts in the energy sector. I would say that in general, unstable, inefficient, economically, financially challenging situation of state-owned enterprises and other market players are again factors which contribute to corruption risks. Therefore, the debt situation should be resolved in a clear way. And it is important that also the resolution of debt problems takes place in a transparent and systematic way, and the relevant decisions are made on a regular basis, public and disclosed clearly to everyone who is participating in the market. So here we come to the final slide with the kind invitation to read the full report or OECD Anti-Corruption Review of the Energy Sector in Ukraine. I do hope that everyone will find something useful in this report. And I would like to thank you everyone for attention, and I'm of course absolutely ready and happy to also further participate in debates on these matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valts. Very difficult task yours to summarize the first two chapters, which are extremely rich. I see one hand up from participants, and I remind everyone that there is definitely time for questions and answers. And for once, I must say I'm very proud we're running on time. So I'm sure there's going to be time for question and answers from the audience. I invite you to please put your questions in the chat. You can write them, and we will be receiving your questions and sharing them to our panelists. But let us first start the panel discussion, and then we'll come back to questions. But I will take a good note of the request to speak, and we hope to have a rich session of questions and answers a bit later. Okay, now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Yaroslav Nemchenkov, Deputy Minister of Energy of Ukraine, and very important and close partner of OECD work in Ukraine, since this project has covered very many areas, ranging from looking at the energy strategy of Ukraine to identifying corruption risks. So thank you very much, Deputy Minister, for being here. Thank you for being a strong partner for us. And this is, hope, the result of a very fruitful and hopefully long-standing cooperation with you and your ministry going forward. The floor is yours, please.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you for such important and relevant discussion and anti-corruption review of the energy sector. I do really appreciate to have your review, and thank you to OECD for a long and fruitful cooperation with our ministry and for your interest in improving Ukraine's energy sector. We really appreciate your job. I have prepared my speech in Ukrainian, so now I'm going to switch to Ukrainian. Thank you. Шановні колеги.
Dear colleagues, in fact, there are no states which are absolutely free from corruption. However, today we are able to construct an efficient system to combat this phenomenon. It's really great that we have such studies, such overviews that help us identify the areas affected by corruption risks or characterized by the corruption itself. Due to such studies, we'll be able to develop a joint action plan to overcome these notorious phenomena. We are doing our best, and indeed we can boast of a certain level of success. I'm saying that this is the certain level of success. Indeed, the overview proves that there is still much of work ahead of us. We should be aware of the fact that only consolidated efforts, regular efforts are required to combat corruption forever. Efficient anti-corruption steps are like ebb and tide. There are ups and downs. We at the ministry have to cooperate regularly with the Energy Regulatory Authority, Financial Regulatory Authority, anti-corruption authorities, international organizations, and civil society of Ukraine. The key element of the ministry's policy is the design of new anti-corruption program. Its goal is to establish an efficient anti-corruption system, primarily within the Ministry of Energy itself. We are also aiming at a corruption-free environment at SOEs. Under the ministry, and in this respect, we closely cooperate with our expert environment and our civil society partners. The Ministry of Energy also affects some enterprises whose corporate rights we manage. We've got the Public Council. On the basis of its assessments, we analyze the internal and the external environment of the ministry in order to develop the reports and anti-corruption programs. We also persist in implementing anti-corruption practices at state-owned enterprises under the ministry. First and foremost, I'm implying the pipelines of Ukraine operated by the GTS operator and Ukrenergo. These two enterprises have the supervisory boards active. It's highly important because the supervisory boards contribute to the reduction of corruption. The supervisory board work together with the ministry to combat these corruption challenges. An important step in the anti-corruption activity has become the change in corporate governance. The well-known international governance standards have been adopted in Ukraine as well, and such activities have borne their fruit. In November this year, a decision was made that all procurements estimated at above 200 million hryvnias should be preliminarily analyzed by the supervisory board of the ministry. Given that the technical opinion is satisfactory, then the procurement can be done only through the ProZorro platform. And after the auction, the supervisory board can approve the awarding. So again, let me emphasize that this is about the procurement estimated at above 200 million hryvnias. The civil society sends lots of signals about possible corruption practices during the procurement. Therefore, we inform the supervisory board about the need to monitor the corruption risks. And secondly, we suggested that the supervisory board controls the most massive, most important procurements, and all the procurement should be done in the competitive manner and through the ProZorro platform. This tool has proved to be efficient. It has been in operation for a little bit more than a month, but this has been enough for the supervisory board of Ukrainian pipelines to review the issue of renovation of some section of the pipeline. The supervisory board made a decision to establish a task force on investigation of procurements related to such renovation. According to the new procedure of procurement approval, the supervisory board of the Ukrainian pipelines approved the services of balancing for the operators. After the auction, the supervisory board will also control the issue of making agreements with those who have won the auction. The supervisory board of the pipelines of Ukrainian pipelines has empowered the GTS operator with the development of modernization strategy for the GTS. Due to this strategy, equipment of each compressor station will be procured on the basis of continuous monitoring for corruption risks. Thus, the agreements amounting to billions of hryvnias will be signed. The decisions are not made intransparently. The position of the supervisory board is articulated according to the principles of the corporate governance. This is actually the prerequisite for prevention of corruption risks. And now let's proceed with Ukrenergo. On December 17th, New York passed a decision, ultimate decision on certification of this operator. This is the ISO model certification. The Secretariat of Energy Community confirmed that this decision is in line with the third energy package. The Ministry of Energy, as the governing body, does not have all the assets in all segments of the branch. Well, the corporate governance is fully in line with international standards. What does it mean? This means that the corruption, abuse, or conflict of interest in the work of Ukrenergo are excluded because there are safeguards. And the safeguard, one of the such safeguards, or one of the process, the certification. And a couple of words about the market operator. This year, the market operator has successfully completed the international audit, focusing on compliance with ISO 3701. The compliance policy is in place, and there is also an anti-corruption officer. Let me share another important message. We can work with the enterprises I mentioned, with some other enterprises. We're able to act through international standards, governance standards, through supervisory boards. However, the second step is no less important. This is the integration of Ukrainian energy markets into the European markets. We realize that only by implementing European practices, by minimizing the corruption risks, by eliminating conflict of interests when deciding on the land plots, by empowering the market, will be able to put an end to monopolies, to prevent undesired interventions into the activity of market participants. And it's highly important to keep this synchronization, to keep these European market rules working in Ukraine. I'm sure that we are just at the start of the anti-corruption transformations in the energy sector. There are cases where the anti-corruption measures do not work efficiently. However, we can involve the proven tools such as civil society and international support. Indeed, our willingness, our decisiveness are crucial in this respect. Both the ministry and the minister in person focus a lot on corruption risk prevention. Therefore, we prioritize the European integration. We've got the corporate governance in action, and the team of the ministry is aimed at putting an end to corruption in all energy markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Danchenko, for your words. Very important topics because, as you know, we have worked on issues related to procurement, how to fight bid rigging in the state-owned companies in the energy sector. We have identified some risks, and actually we are very pleased to see, by the way, that some of the recommendations have been put in place, particularly in Ukrenergo, with whom we worked very closely for that work. And we understand that your support is going to be essential to ensure that the framework remains stable, not only for procurement, but also other issues such as you mentioned, the corporate governance of state-owned enterprises in the energy sector. Some of those who are very closely under your radar. And we will continue with the Norwegian support actually to monitor that work and implementation of the reform in line with international standards. So we count on your continued support, and thank you very much for being here, and hope you can stay for the Q&A questions because we already see some questions. Thank you. I will now give the floor to Ms. Olha Batova. She's the first deputy chair of the State Property Fund of Ukraine. If you can share with us your views and what you see as the key challenges, since there's a big plan of privatization going on in Ukraine under the responsibility of State Property Fund, and the role that you play in addressing corruption risks. Thank you very much for being here.
Hello, dear colleagues. I hope you hear me well. I'm very appreciative for the invitation to the speaker today. I will proceed in Ukrainian to be more точною і для того, щоб я змогла покрити
So I will be switching to Ukrainian to be more accurate and to be able to cover the entire material I would like to share with you today. First of all, let me emphasize the activities of the State Property Fund throughout the past several years. In terms of anti-corruption reform, first, the fund has started differentiating between enterprises according to the so-called concept of clusters. There are over 500 enterprises in total, state-owned enterprises in total, and now we work deliberately with clusters such as the energy enterprise cluster. The Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine made a decision on transferring the HCPs to the authority of the ministry, and the ministry will continue its work with the enterprises. And as Mr. Demchenkov has mentioned, an important step was implementation of independent supervisory boards at each SOE. The supervisory board works now at Center Energo and at some other SOEs. Unfortunately, the nomination committee has failed to appoint independent supervisory boards at Obl Energos. This will be the objective of the Ministry of Energy. Anyway, at some enterprises, the supervisory boards have been active for 3 months so far. This means a significant progress in terms of compliance, making agreements, and all other areas the leadership works with. Secondly, our fund focuses on monitoring of indicators. Previously, the enterprises used to submit their financial plan in the beginning of each year, and then they reported on implementation, on actual implementation. Yet now, our fund receives the information on weekly, monthly, and quarterly basis. We now know the situation, and we see what kind of agreements enterprises are going to make. At the fund, we have also developed a checklist for approving the substantial agreements, and at the moment we are involved in a thorough analysis, in the scrutiny of these agreements prior to their approval. Such practice as anti-corruption officers has been implemented at the 16 joint stock enterprises and the 32 state-owned enterprises. The State Property Fund also cooperates with the USAID in improving standards and practices of SOE governance. We work with the NO International and Centrenergo and Zaporizhzhia Oblenergo are now applying the methodology approved by us of anti-corruption compliance with 11 criteria.
From supervisory board to the head of the enterprise and to the business partners. Unfortunately, I can say that by results of the use of implementation of this methodology, no Centrenergo, no Zaporizhzhia Energo haven't scored enough points for basic level. It means that we have a lot of work to do in the future. We need to use best practices, and there is a lot to be done. Among the problems that we have in the implementation of all international criteria, there is a problem that very often enterprises review the anti-corruption strategy, policies, and compliance as some kind of formality. So they sign these regulations, but nobody implements them in real practice. As of now, we plan in January 2022, we plan to organize a training for the members of the supervisory boards and for workers of the fund who are representatives of the shareholders of the supervisory board, for the management and for employees of the monitoring and evaluation department of the enterprises. With the support of USAID, this training will be aimed at implementing all the strategies in practice, so members of the supervisory board know what to do, how to use properly these best recommendations and best practices. And we also need to identify those risks that we need to take into account. As an example, one of our enterprises, we have sold products through Prozoro, not only procurement by selling the products. And it seems to me that the best fight against corruption is based on automatization of all the processes. It will lead to openness and transparency of these processes. All of the methods that we use in the fund for privatization, selling of using the system Prozoro, and we have evidence that it's impossible to have an influence, to influence the result, and that this is just a zero tolerance to corruption, zero option. So zero tolerance to corruption, it means that it won't happen because of this automation. As of now, speaking of privatization, we work with amendments to the legal framework, so we can So we at Centrenergo, we can put for privatization based on facts. If we manage to adopt amendments to the relevant legislation this January, I hope that in the end of summer, in the beginning of autumn, Centrenergo, together with several other stakeholders, which will be the basis for consumption for Centrenergo, will be sold this next year. Those problems that we see in our fund and at different enterprises that report to us, I think that this problem can be tackled by the decrease the role of the participants of the state in the business. The only solution to fight corruption in this area is to privatize these companies, because it seems to me it is impossible to have 3,600 enterprises ruled by 90 authorities. No matter what we do, this corruption will prevail if the situation stays as it is. So we, as the fund, will have a lot of goals for the next year. Our key task is to privatize as many enterprises as possible and enterprises related to energy generation, which are owned by the state. Centrenergo. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. A lot happening, and certainly very important developments as, sorry, let me speak from the off channel. Yes, certainly very important developments as Centrenergo is a very, very large and important company. Same, we're following very closely the case of Artem, and we really hope that this work, not only again on the anti-corruption, but also more broadly on as part of this larger energy sector reform project, can be of use, and I'm talking here to all the actors present here, from the government to different bodies involved, can be of use for a real transparent and effective transformation of the sector for the benefit of Ukraine. So thank you for your words and very important conversation. Please stay with us. We see there are questions still coming, but we have our last but not least speaker, Mr. Juraj Strasser. He's acting manager director of chief compliance officer of policy, ethics and investigations at the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. Also long-standing partner of OECD since many years. Very nice to see you again. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Juraj, the floor is yours if you can tell us how this work is relevant and in line with what EBRD is doing also very actively in Ukraine. Please.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, and good afternoon, and really nice to see you, and nice to see all the partners with whom indeed I have been working for quite a few years in Ukraine. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be with you today on behalf of the EBRD for the launch of this important anti-corruption review of the energy sector in Ukraine by the OECD. One of the key objectives of the EBRD strategy for Ukraine is the creation of a transparent, well-regulated and efficient energy sector. Efforts to improve competitiveness and attractiveness to credible and reputable investors, and in so doing to strengthen Ukraine's energy and economic security, have been at the heart of our work in the country. Ukraine has in recent years made a significant progress to define and pursue a policy reform agenda, build legal and institutional frameworks, and increase transparency and competitiveness in the energy sector. However, significant challenges remain. At a policy and practical level, there's still ample room for corruption to occur. This negatively affects Ukraine's investment climate and ought to be addressed, given the key role that foreign and private sector investment needs to play in Ukraine's transition to a low carbon and more sustainable economy. In terms of policy engagement, at a structural level, the EBRD and international community remain focused on working with the Ukrainian government to reduce the space for corruption in the energy sector. At the heart of these efforts are: 1, market liberalization, transparency and integration with Europe; 2, independent and effective energy market regulation; and 3, increased production and diversified energy supply. I was happy to note that the review contains a number of relevant and detailed recommendations along the lines of the above mentioned priorities. Given the continuing dominance of the state in Ukraine's energy markets, engagement with state bodies is central focus of Ukraine's international partners. Creating, supporting, and maintaining well-run state actors who operate independently, responsibly, and ethically is a key goal for all stakeholders. To this end, the review's call to make anti-corruption efforts a bigger priority for the leadership of state institutions is important, as the recommendation to match political rhetoric and official statements about the importance of these issues with a more concrete focus on them in sectoral development programs and strategies. A number of key SOEs in the energy sector have in recent years developed transparency measures, implemented anti-corruption programs, and established communication channels for reporting wrongdoing. However, as the review notes, the consistency and effectiveness of these programs across all state entities operating in the sector is still something that needs to be addressed. I wish to briefly reflect on a couple of important observations from the review in this area. First, developing and implementing effective anti-bribery and corruption compliance measures in state entities is inherently linked to the success of broader corporate governance and sectoral reforms, and depend on the political will to respect and maintain these for the long term. The review's conclusion that, and I quote, an overarching theme in the energy sector is arbitrary administrative or political interventions in the activities of state-owned enterprises, unquote, reflects the wider sentiment which needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. Second, and relatedly, a major obstacle to successful anti-corruption efforts in the energy sector is the fact that not enough supervisory boards and management teams are selected via truly transparent, merit-based and competitive processes. Third, compliance officers and stakeholders shared a sense of a lack of tone from the top, which was cited as one of the biggest problems in terms of building a culture of integrity in SOEs. Fourth, the review rightly raises concerns about the lack of independence of anti-corruption officers, stemming from the fact that these individuals are appointed and dismissed by a head of the organization. This generates real conflict of interest risks in the monitoring, detecting, and acting on corruption and management levels. The review proposal that anti-corruption officers be appointed and dismissed by an external body, such as the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, would certainly help strengthen their independence. In terms of public sector procurement, this is obviously another very important area, and it has been mentioned by previous speakers, in which the review addresses. It rightly identifies abuse of simplified and negotiated procurement procedures and manipulation of procurement thresholds to avoid the Prozoro platform as key risks. This is a very broad area, but in a nutshell, we strongly advocate for the strengthening of the Prozoro and the Dozoro systems as a basis for more transparent and competitive procurement. In terms of private sector, as a core part of its mandate in Ukraine, the EBRD continues to seek out reputable private sector investors for the energy sector. The EBRD applies robust integrity due diligence to potential clients. Unfortunately, it is not always easy to find companies which are unaligned with political, oligarchic, or vested interests. There are examples, however, an implementation of sectoral reforms and the review's recommendations would help to moderate investor concerns. Finally, I was pleased to see the review highlighted several examples of successful non-governmental integrity and anti-corruption initiatives, including those that are supported by the EBRD and OECD. The Business Ombudsman Council of Ukraine helps many businesses to address corruption-related risks and problems. Likewise, the Ukrainian Network for Integrity and Compliance, UNIC, promotes compliance and integrity standards and works on capacity building with private and state sector companies. The review also rightly notes the important role that the civil society organizations and businesses and business associations play in this area, and indeed notes areas for greater participation by these groups. In conclusion, I think that there are a number of issues that the report really highlights. Now the most important part will be the implementation, and there is always the issue of the devil in the detail. So I hope that together with the OECD, the international partners, but in particular the government, the civil society, the private sector, but also the public sector participants, we would be able to address those issues. And I would like to thank the OECD for undertaking this timely and important anti-corruption review, which is funded by the Norwegian government, who have done so much to support the energy sector and anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine. The EBRD remains ready to work with all of you, and hopefully we will be successful as we have been over the past couple of years, but hopefully the implementation will be even more successful with the help of this report. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Juraj. And it's true that only to mention few, the Business Ombudsman Council, Ukrainian Network for Integrity and Compliance, and a lot of very useful cooperation, even behind the scenes on the corporate governance front as well. Very strong partnership with EBRD. We're very grateful for your presence here, and also for the points that you raised in terms of the importance of really strengthening anti-bribery, corruption, compliance issues using Prosoro. We heard Deputy Minister before that's the case, and it's encouraged, but still we have identified cases where this is not enforced, and so we have to assist and hopefully continue monitoring the situation to ensure that these and other acts are avoided, so that Ukraine can benefit from the reputation that it could and it should, because it has great potential and great people behind. So we have still like 5 minutes before we move to the next session. There's now time for questions and answers, and I see that we have already one question in the chat. So please, you're invited to write your questions in the chat, and we're going to take them as we receive them. I see a question from Mr. Vladislav Obiziuk, probably most likely to our OECD expert on how OECD assesses the role of NERC, the regulator, in terms of its support to resolution of the payment crisis in the sector and in the renewable energy sector specifically. Is the regulator, de facto independent status? Do we have some comments? I must say that Commissioner Babi couldn't join us today, because that, of course, would have been a question also to her interest. But Valts, if you can pick it up and perhaps give a comment on this from the report, and if colleagues can spotlight our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will start with the second part of the question. I think and we reflected in the report, it is really one major topic of concern, that the status of the regulatory commission is still a highly contested matter and in Ukraine, and it is a matter which is has been subject to ongoing acute confrontations of different interests concerning the status of the institution as a whole, and concerning the status of the commission members. And overall, I would view this still as a large risk for the independence and stability of the institution as such. Now, regarding the question, when it comes to the resolution of the payment crisis, I think we as authors of this anti-corruption focused report should be perhaps cautious in discussing these deep non-anti-corruption issues of the regulation and resolution of this debt problem in the market. But certainly, I think from our report's point of view, there are, of course, many actors, the legislature and the government, and of course also the regulatory commission itself and other actors involved in this situation. So I would probably refrain from specifically arguing that NEOC has had a very specific, let's say, role or fault in this situation. No, you know, I would stay somewhat neutral on this topic. But the independence status is still a concern, that's for sure.
Thank you very much, Valts, for picking up on this. Participants are invited if you wish to ask an extra question. If not, I don't know if speakers and discussants would like to add something or ask a question. What I would like to add to your answer, Valts, is that in a parallel project that the OECD is carrying out with the support of the European Union, we will be looking actually more closely into the regulator and the role of its payment in the renewable energy debts, because we're looking at the competition issues in the electricity sector, working closely with the Anti-Monopoly Committee of Ukraine, and certainly the regulator is highly involved. So we will be sharing the findings as we move forward, and we hope to bring some light and also some recommendations to address these concerns, which we are aware of and we're following closely. No more questions? Well, for once, I'm happy to pass then the floor to my colleague who will be moderating the second session, my colleague Olga Savran, manager of the OECD Anti-Corruption Network for Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and keeping you in good hands, and talk to you later. Thank you very much for your attention. Olga, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gabriela, for running even earlier than the agenda gave us time. I first of all would like to call on the speakers of this panel to turn on your cameras. Сергій Деркач, Юрій Ющенко, Тетяна Коротка, Антоніна Прудко. Будь ласка, включіть свої камери, щоб ми вас бачили усі. And with this, I will start back in English, this panel. So the first panel, as you have seen, was looking into the, from my point of view, extremely complicated jungle of regulations and institutions and practices in the energy sector, trying to understand the risk areas. And this session will look into the anti-corruption infrastructure and tools, and we will try to understand how much we have used, or Ukraine has used all these instruments in the energy sector. And first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Olga Savran. I'm the manager of the Anti-Corruption Network for Eastern Europe, Central Asia, that is responsible for this part of the Norwegian project in Ukraine, but also for the anti-corruption monitoring since the Ukraine. And we have just recently finished the anti-corruption monitoring in Ukraine, which indeed said that the country has well-developed anti-corruption legislation and well-developed anti-corruption institutions. Of course, they are attacked every time they deliver, and they start biting the oligarchic instruments, but they are in place. And there are lots of excellent tools that these institutions already have, from e-declarations to Prozoro, whistleblower channels, just to name a few. On the side of the corporate governance of state-owned enterprises, which are the key players in the energy sector of Ukraine still, we have done some reviews in the past, and our colleagues continue doing that. We see that the reform comes and goes, and it's very much linked to the key issue, anti-corruption issue for all our region. That's the high-level corruption, political corruption. How far the available anti-corruption tools did apply in the energy sector? I think the report clearly says not a lot yet. And so in this session, I would like, first of all, to invite Tanya Khovanska to present the findings of what we know about anti-corruption tools in the energy sector. And after Tanya, who will have 10 minutes, we will have 4 discussants. We will have Sergei Derkach from the National Anti-Corruption Commission. That's the main body that develops policy, but also it's responsible for anti-corruption representatives in state-owned enterprises. We will listen to one specific case from Ukrhydroenergo, from Yuri Yushchenko, and then we will listen to Tatiana Korotka from Business Ombudsman and Antonina Prudko from UNIC. So let's start, Tanya.
Thank you, Olga. And I will ask my colleagues to put up my presentation. I hope you can hear me well. It is my pleasure today to present for you the anti-corruption review in the energy sector section, which focuses specifically on anti-corruption measures that are implemented by the government of Ukraine. And I will now go ahead and do this. Next slide, please. So I will start with something that has been mentioned many times today, over and over. So I think that I will just drive this message home once again. So to ensure that the anti-corruption measures of the state are adequate and that they are really responding to the real corruption risks and the real corruption existing in any sector, including the energy sector, that they are working, that they receive the proper attention, both from the government and from the public, the state needs to have anti-corruption policy in place. And this anti-corruption policy would provide a vision, a strategy, and would be an instrument to report to the public on what the government is doing in order to address the corruption and corruption risks. Conceptually, Ukraine follows this good practice. And in principle, it has at the national level, the national anti-corruption strategy, and at the level of the state institutions, it calls for development and adoption of the anti-corruption programs. However, currently, and actually since 2017, there is no national anti-corruption strategy that has been adopted. When preparing for this presentation this morning, I checked, and in the last 4 months, Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine has adopted 244 legal acts. So in 4 months, 244 legal acts. The draft law on the adoption of the anti-corruption strategy has been submitted or registered in the parliament 16 months ago. That poses a question which is raised in this report and in many other reports that have been developed by other organizations, and including OECD. Just recently, OECD has completed the 5th round pilot monitoring under the Istanbul Anti-Corruption Action Plan. There it has identified and actually commended Ukraine on preparing a draft anti-corruption strategy in a very inclusive, transparent manner of public consultations. It further stated that the draft was based on evidence and then targeted important corruption risks. In our review, we find that is true, but more so that many of the instruments that have been included into the national anti-corruption strategy would actually address many of the risks that we have identified and will help make sure that the tools that are there at the national level could be actually applied at the level of the sector. However, as I already said, and as many other speakers, both from the government and non-governmental, meaning the EBRD, have already said that the strategy has not been adopted. So obviously this raises questions and in our view equals to failure or a lack of ability to tackle corruption in a consistent, coherent and strategic manner from Ukraine. But also, of course, it raises questions about real political will to address this issue. I think that the second important part of this part of the review that we wanted to draw your attention to is the fact that, of course, in order to have any type of anti-corruption strategy that would be working and that would be addressing the real risks, these risks would have to be assessed. Until now, the risk assessment in the energy sector has not been performed, and as it was already told to us by a few of my previous speakers, and in particular by the director of the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, this is one of the areas that has been identified for the in-depth strategic risk assessment. And in our report, in our review, we actually praise Ukraine for this, and we look forward to this risk analysis. And we are happy that our review will help Ukraine develop this, and we are committed to work with Ukraine further on this. And the report elaborates on this issue. Then we go into the national anti-corruption programs at the institutional level. And as I said, in Ukraine, they do exist. So all state institutions in the energy sector, the ministries and other institutions are obliged to adopt anti-corruption programs within their institutions and monitor its implementation. The way it is done is kind of typical for most of the state institutions. Usually it is in the hands of the anti-corruption unit or anti-corruption officer, which provides for organizational work on the risk assessment. Then a special commission is set up in the state institution, which assesses these risks and proposes different measures in order to counter these risks. And then the draft program is shared with National Agency on Corruption Prevention for their review and for further approval. Then at this point, the National Agency on Corruption Prevention comes in and reviews the program, provides its inputs, and either approves it or sends it back for further development. And here the question is, which is raised by the anti-corruption review, is the fact that in order for the National Agency on Corruption Prevention to do this job effectively, they would need to understand and know the risks in the energy sector. So we go back to the strategic risk analysis of the energy sector and to the fact that there is no such assessment that has been done so far. So basically, the process is more or less kind of rendered to a formalistic procedure that has to be either approved or disapproved by the National Agency on Corruption Prevention. Then I will just quickly talk a little bit about the findings of the anti-corruption review in regards to the risk analysis at the institutional level. We looked at both the organization of the process, and I described a little bit how it is done. We also looked at the resources that are forwarded to this process, and I can tell you that in general, the findings of the report highlight that the resources are very limited, that basically these commissions are composed of persons who are the heads of different departments that do not deal with anti-corruption and sometimes are not quite aware of both the corruption or anti-corruption legislation, as well as just approve or disapprove whatever was prepared to them by the anti-corruption officer. The involvement of the outside stakeholders, we also take a look at this in our review, and what we find is that while most institutions in the energy sector are open and in principle do not object to participation from the outside stakeholders, they're not proactive enough in order to bring them in and to invite them into this process. And sometimes there's not enough of feedback, and sometimes the inputs and the feedback from the outside stakeholders is not taken on board fully or not explained why it was not taken on board. So the civil society and other experts are not interested in participating in the process of the corruption risk assessment. Another issue that the anti-corruption review is highlighting in this regard is the actual assessment of the risks. And the actual assessment of the risks, or the problems with the actual assessment of the risks that are identified in the anti-corruption review, are twofold. Firstly, the risks are very often, or not even very often, but in all cases that we have reviewed for all state institutions in the energy sector, focus on the functions of the institution in place in question. So, for example, if it is the risk assessment done by the Ministry of Energy or by NERC or by State Geology Service, they look at their own functions from a fairly legalistic point of view. To see what corruption risks could be identified in these functions. So the corruption risks in the external environment, so basically in the environment that is regulated by the institutions or that is managed by the institutions or for which the institution is responsible, are not being assessed during the risk assessment. So basically risk assessment is only one-sided. And another problem that we have found with risk assessment is the fact that very often the kind of high-profile risks or more difficult and complicated ones are not included in the anti-corruption programs because for several reasons. As we were explained, very often the participants of the assessment process believe that there's no point in including different corruption risks that cannot be addressed by this institution into the program. And sometimes, especially in the opinion of the non-governmental stakeholders, when the risks are of political nature, they're not included in the program as well. So, for example, such risks as the independence of the anti-corruption officers within the state institutions of the energy sector are never seen in the anti-corruption programs of these institutions, while when we talk to both the government stakeholders and the non-governmental stakeholders, they identified it as one of the high risks. The same would be true, for example, for the risk of capture of the management of state institutions that has been put forward by non-governmental stakeholders as a proposal to be included in the anti-corruption program, for example, for the Ministry of Energy, but has not been included. Another problem in the same area is the role of the National Agency of Corruption Prevention. The National Agency on Corruption Prevention, as Olga said, has a broad range of functions. And its role vis-a-vis other state institutions in the energy sector is very kind of important, but at the same time, it cannot carry out its functions in vacuum. It actually needs support from the anti-corruption officers and units in the state institutions, which are created in all state institutions of the energy sector. They also have very wide range of functions, kind of mirroring the functions of National Agency on Corruption Prevention. So basically, they're looking at development of the anti-corruption programs, monitoring of their implementation. They're looking at implementation of different anti-corruption tools, such as conflict of interest, asset declarations, whistleblower protection. They're looking at the reporting channels. They're providing advice on ethical dilemmas to the staff of their ministries or their institutions. They're also reviewing the reports of corruption violations. So basically, the functions are very big. And for that, there is usually a unit, anti-corruption unit within the state institution, which in our findings of the report in most cases was very understaffed. So for example, just to give you an example, the anti-corruption unit in the Ministry of Energy, which has a staff of 300 persons, which oversees over 500,000 units of the state assets in the energy sector, has 3 persons in the anti-corruption unit of this agency. The same, for example, if we look at the anti-corruption unit of NERC, we will see that there are 2 people there, and NERC and this anti-corruption officer is responsible both for the regulations and the work of NERC at the central level, as well as the work of all of the regional offices of NERC, which exist in all oblasts of Ukraine. So again, the capacity in human terms is very small and requires boosting up. So we talk about that. And we also identify the point of independence of the anti-corruption officers. And we specifically point at the appointment, reporting, and dismissal of the officers, and the same problems we see in regards to the compliance officers and SOEs. There has been a lot said today already about them. And what I will tell you that is a bit different from the anti-corruption officers in the state institutions is I think that there is one specific problem that we identified for SOEs, and that is the fact that there are multiple approaches to meeting the national requirements in regards to introducing this institution in the state-owned enterprises. So some state-owned enterprises introduce the anti-corruption officers or persons that are responsible for anti-corruption program in line with anti-corruption legislation of Ukraine. And then in addition to that, they create functions of compliance officers. And in addition to that, they create functions of anti-corruption compliance officers. So there are some big state-owned enterprises that have 2 or 3 similar services that have similar functions that are not streamlined and do their own things separately. Then we also talk about independence of the officers, anti-corruption officers and compliance officers and SOEs. Next slide, please.
Tanya, I would like to ask you to round up.
Absolutely. And so finally, the report looks at the tools to prevent corruption at the sector level. We look at how all of these tools translate into the sector level, the anti-corruption expertise, the coordination and methodological support, oversight, conflict of interest, asset declarations, whistleblower protection, and how the anti-corruption legislation is applied to SOEs. I think that I will quickly, next slide, just show you the recommendations. So the first recommendation, the key recommendation is to adopt the anti-corruption strategy. The second key recommendation that we talk about is the clear signaling from the top officials on anti-corruption. Next slide, please. We also recommend that Ukraine conducts the strategic risk assessment, which is planned, that the risk assessment at the level of the institutions is ensured properly, and that the monitoring of the implementation of the anti-corruption programs is also ensured properly at the level of the state bodies in the energy sector. In the last slide. We also recommend, and that is one of the key recommendations, is to enhance the capacities of the anti-corruption units in the state bodies to ensure the independence of the anti-corruption officers in the state bodies in the energy sector, and the same recommendations are also reflected for state-owned enterprises. At this, I will stop, and thank you very much, and I encourage you all to read the report.
Thank you very much, Tanya. In order to save the time, I will immediately go to our discussants, and the first would be Serhiy Tkach. I see that you are here, Serhiy. You can turn on your screen, please.
Colleagues, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but we cannot see you.
Okay. Just give me a second.
Turn on the camera. Perfect. We can see you. Thank you very much for joining us today. Serhiy, you come from National Agency for Corruption Prevention. We've heard already that you have developed a strategy that unfortunately has not been adopted yet. You disappeared again. Okay. And we've heard about the anti-corruption representatives that you are appointing in various state-owned enterprises and about the plans to do the risk assessment. Can you tell us how, once implemented, these will address our recommendations and corruption risks in the sector?
Okay, thank you very much, colleagues. I'm really happy to participate today at this event. And as Tatiana rightly mentioned about the strategy and about all the issues that we have right now with the implementation of anti-corruption, let's say, best practices and initiatives. Firstly, I would say from the, let's say, state level, we are still very much hoping to get as soon as possible anti-corruption strategy. And even though the strategy does not have a specific area, separate one on energy sector, but it has a lot of like precise activities that should be implemented, which will give the huge result on anti-corruption in the sphere of energy sector as well. For example, it's the proper corporate governance of state-owned enterprises. This is also transparency of privatization processes. It's also the strategy also touch the issue of stimulating competition in energy markets, and in particular by strengthening the antitrust law, and also simplification of procedures and the development of services of the implementation in the energy sectors. It's about the strategy itself. If we are talking about the issues and the main actually task for the energy sector, what we see right now from the NACP perspective, the first task would be like development, even together with NACP, and strengthen the Institute of Authorized Units or Anti-Corruption Officers. As Tanya mentioned recently about the problem with the creation of the units within the energy sector, we see this problem actually by with other state institutions as well, but in our energy sector the problem is huge. The anti-corruption units are not created in like the way like our legislation says. So there are not much resources to fight and to prevent corruption within this institution. So the first task actually to create anti-corruption units within the state institutions and state-owned enterprises in the energy sector. The second thing will be actually ensuring guarantees of their independence and actually promoting their effective work. They need human resources, they need the financial resources to work efficiently and to conduct their tasks. And thirdly, actually, it's to facilitate a comprehensive corruption risk assessment within all the state institutions and all state enterprises. What we can see right now that not all the agencies are actually working thoroughly on corruption risk assessment. Some of them are not doing it at all. Some of them, if they are facilitating corruption risk assessment, it's only for the sake of ticking the box, adhering to the Ukrainian legislation, but it's not a real tool and a real instrument which is used to prevent corruption. So from our perspective, we see it as one of the huge challenges that the energy sector is facing, and we are pointing out all the time on this, and happy to help on it. I will tell a bit more what we are doing in this sphere. And lastly, it's also what Tanya mentioned is the tone from the top. This is the huge main task actually to let's say to have a dialogue with the heads of institutions and the heads of state-owned enterprises in the energy sector in terms of their role in anti-corruption work within their agencies. Usually, the head of institutions, what we can see in Ukraine generally, they don't see their active role and their responsibility to implement anti-corruption measures within the company and to, let's say, show the tone from the top in terms of zero tolerance on corruption, and to actually highlight the necessity of implementing anti-corruption tasks and helping work of anti-corruption officer. That's what we see like the main should be the main task and KPIs for the energy sector institutions. From NACP perspective, what we are doing right now and what can be as the help for starting from the next year. This year we started several pilot projects to create a comprehensive and effective compliance services within state institutions. We have this pilot project, for example, in the Pension Fund of Ukraine, where we, together with the anti-corruption officers of the pension fund, facilitated fully fledged corruption risk assessment. And the result was the submission of an adoption by the NACP anti-corruption program of the pension fund, with very, very detailed list of activities and risk register and list of activities to mitigate these risks. Also, we are working with them, with the pension fund, to create all necessary anti-corruption policies within the institution. So with this experience and perspective, we can work next year with the some of the state-owned enterprises or agencies from the energy sector and support to create, let's say, an example of anti-corruption compliance system within the agency. Second actually activity what we've done this year, it's the training on corruption risk assessment and preparation of the anti-corruption program. We taught about more than 60 anti-corruption officers from different state institutions. So next year we are continuing with this, and we will have several trainings, and we will be happy to see all anti-corruption officers from the energy sector for the training, so we can actually go deeper in corruption risk assessment and all methodology. Two more things. The third one is our methodological recommendations that we are actually working on. Several of them we had issued this year, and next year we also will be working on the other ones. So this is the work that will be, I mean, all the methodological recommendations are open on our website, so everybody, including anti-corruption officers from the energy sector, will be using these methodological recommendations. And lastly, I would say that very important actually document which was signed by the head of an ACP last week and was sent for the registration to the Ministry of Justice. This is the standard program of standard anti-corruption program for legal entities. This is one of the most important documents which is used by all state-owned enterprises in Ukraine as the guide for the, let's say, formulating anti-corruption policy within the enterprise. So this new renewed document is prepared, and soon we will be working on, let's say, providing methodological recommendations how to use it, including using of the all international standards. And another, let's say, from strategical point of view, what an ACP is also doing, it's a strategic risk, corruption risk analysis. Last year, we had several spheres of economy and public administration that we went very deep and analyzed. It's a land sector, it's infrastructure sector, it's defense sector. For the next year, we are planning to go to the energy sector and facilitate full-fledged corruption risk assessment within the sphere. So that's why this assessment, which was actually done by the OECD, would be like some sort of baseline assessment and help for us. And then we will go sector by sector in the energy sphere, and we will be actually issuing the risk register from the strategic perspective for the energy sector, with the concrete measures for example, parliament on different levels, for the parliament, for the government, for the concrete state institution, how to mitigate these risks. And we would be happy to work with all institutions within the energy sector and together with the international organizations. This is very shortly from our perspective, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Serhiy. So I really took a lot of notes, but there's no time to repeat everything. It's basically risk assessment that you have in mind, training, methodological support. With this in mind, I will now turn to Yuri Yushchenko, who is the head of the Service for the Anti-Corruption Program implementation in the state-owned enterprise Ukrhydroenergo. Yuri, you actually are in the middle of implementing all the measures that Serhiy was talking about. How much does it help? How much does it not help? Please share with us your experience. You are between the owners, managers on one side, anti-corruption authorities on the other side. How do you coordinate all this work? How do you communicate with all your different managers and bosses? What is most helpful? What are you planning to do in the near future? Please.
Доброго дня.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would like to tell you first that after adoption in 2014 of the new edition of the anti-corruption law. In April 2015, I became commissioner on implementation of this anti-corruption program. And in 2017, taking into account the structure and the number of employees, we have created an agency to implement this anti-corruption program. In 2018, on the initiative of the General Director, taking into account 8 units in different regions of Ukraine, we have introduced anti-corruption officers in each of these units all over Ukraine. We did that in order to implement more measures, more activities which we had planned before, and to implement those measures in real life all over Ukraine. In addition to that, by the end of the previous year, taking into account the development and adoption of the corporate code, we have created an agency, compliance agency. The key task of this agency is to implement key provisions of the corporate ethics code, responsible business policy, corporate social responsibility, and gender policy. Taking into account the previous speeches, I would like to say that our compliance agencies, our responsibilities do not overlap. I think it was a good decision because it allows our agency to get focused on the activities which are provided by the law of Ukraine on corruption prevention and the anti-corruption program. I'd like to say that we don't use only formal procedures which are provided by the anti-corruption procedure. From 2019, we have launched the integrity audit for candidates for positions with high corruption risks. General Director has approved those positions. And of course, we include first those positions which should take into account economic functions. We have also launched expertise of the projects related to regulations and legal acts. First, whether they comply with the anti-corruption legal framework. To implement all those measures and activities, it is important to cooperate at the level of integration of those processes at all the units, all the departments. One of the key preconditions for implementation of these programs is the leadership and willingness of the head of our our enterprise and the supervisory board, which was created several years ago. We have proper cooperation with the supervisory board. They provide recommendations. These recommendations are related to what we shall do, so our activities and measures are more efficient and correspond to the highest requirements. We have carried out an external audit of external corruption risks last year. This year, as part of the commission recommended by the supervisory board, we have carried out an audit of internal corruption risks. These shall be events which encompass all spheres of our activities. What is important is to use measures which are easy to understand to all the employees, to the managers of the central department and regional departments. We understand that anti-corruption measures are integrated in almost all the processes that take place in the company. Before, in the past, we paid less attention to the regional departments. This audit, which we have completed by the beginning of December, we have introduced a lot of measures to mitigate corruption risks in the regional departments all over Ukraine. It will lead to increasing responsibility of the anti-corruption officers. And we hope that our recommendations will be taken into account. These are the propositions which were submitted by us this summer with our meeting with the NACP, because according to the legal framework, according to the anti-corruption program, these responsibilities such as reviewing the messages from the whistleblowers, well, the responsibility of the head of the department. However, it requires more explanations. For example, when the whistleblower reaches out to the head of the region department. As for the cooperation with the head of the supervisory board, I'd like to say that we don't have conflicts of interest or as many other enterprises have. Moreover, at the beginning of this December, our director has signed a memorandum with the All-Ukrainian Network of Integrity and Compliance, UNIC. We have created a joint action plan, which we will start implementing soon, and I hope that it will make us closer to the highest standards, including European standards, European experience in preventing and mitigating corruption risks.
The only problem which persists with us, as discussed during the previous discussions, is related to the standards and their terminology. The international standards, including those we are discussing at such platforms, operate with such terms as compliance, compliance policies, compliance programs. We touched upon this issue in the survey run by the OECD. The problem is that our legislation does not embrace this terminology. In my opinion, it is important to initiate the discussion in the legislative field. We should consider whether it's expedient to implement the same terminology, because it is often confused. What is the anti-corruption policy and compliance policies are often confused. However, in terms of the interaction, we do not experience any problems. Of course, lots depends on the leadership, given that the anti-corruption reform has been implemented. Thank you for your attention.
It was very informative, but now we are really short of time, so I'll have to jump quickly to Tatiana Korotka and ask her to share the views of the Business Ombudsman Council about the risks of corruption risks in the energy sector and possible solutions. We have a total 6 minutes for you and Antonina, so let's be very concise.
Okay, I will try to be concise. Good evening, good afternoon, dear colleagues. BOC's experience in energy sector is very diverse. It includes usual complaints against tax and law enforcement agencies, state-owned companies that are natural monopolists in the energy sector, issues of protecting investment in green energy, problems in interacting with regulators, and etc. Each of these violations would be a signal of corruption. And several years ago, we published a systemic report aimed at anti-corruption and increasing the transparency of regulation in terms of connecting to engineer networks, setting tariff, improving the work of the regulatory authority itself, and also working with the business customer complaints. However, in these area, I would like to highlight the most problematic issues related to the state-owned enterprises, because they have very risky areas where they work as the enterprises, yes, producing products, and silent services and areas where there are natural monopolies. So first of all, it's conflict of interest. The second, it's non-fulfillment of contractual and other obligations. Non-enforcement of judicial decisions and the problem of non-enforcement of court decisions, particularly concerning debt collection from SOEs, is in the short list of the most popular compliance subjects. Abuse of dominant or monopoly position through the abuse of the dominant state-owned enterprises impose unfair prices and trading conditions regarding the quality and timeliness of providing services. Actually, direct corruption allegations. Well, sometimes it's also misinterpretations of legislation. What is very good that the report actually reflects all of these type of violations and address the measures how to solve these issues, and definitely it will be our roadmap for the next steps. And I do hope that together we could overcome it, and combining our efforts with the state, with the civil society, professional society like UNIC, with the high-level international institutions, with your advice, we could somehow streamline our efforts and to make this sector more transparent, because it's very difficult to discuss attraction investment to the sector on privatization without the fighting corruption in this sector and trying to increase transparency. So this is all from my side. I try to be on time.
Thank you very much for this effort to be very brief, and also for pinpointing the key risk areas and also echoing with the report. Now, Antonina, last but not least, Ukrainian Network for Integrity and Compliance. We know that there's a lot of state-owned enterprises, also from the energy sector, who are knocking at your door. Please share your experience with us very briefly.
Dear Olga, dear guests, thank you for inviting me, and I will turn to Ukrainian to be quicker. Колеги, багато мала сказати.
Dear colleagues, was going to tell you lots of things, but the last speaker usually has the list of time. It's very nice that you have been mentioning us very frequently. It means that our tools and our activities are useful. Indeed, we were founded several years ago with the support of EBRD, Business Ombudsman, and OECD. Our goal is to implement the cultural compliance, thus reducing the corruption risks, which I'm hearing for both private and public sector. Upon the request of the SOEs, we developed the program, and now we've got 7 partners. 6 of them are from the energy sector. These are the biggest companies from the sector. Speaking about the problems, I fully agree with all the previous speakers who mentioned such problems as the transparency of the supervisory board setup. According to our experience, we see that there are also challenges in terms of appointment of the company's leadership. The procedures should be more transparent. It should be also mentioned that the role of the anti-corruption officers has to be enhanced, and these officers should be independent in terms of direct access to the supervisory board in order to convey the message of corruption violation directly to the supervisory board. So the tone should be set from above. This significantly minimizes the corruption risk at SOEs. So responding to the request from SOEs, we developed a partnership program specifically for SOEs. This is a long-term and systemic program. At start, the company is expected to undergo self-assessment, and as Mr. Yuri has mentioned today, the action plan for 1 or 2 years should be elaborated. Our network of private companies and the Secretariat will be offering certain instruments, certain tools for this or that SOE, which is willing to complete the program successfully. They can join, for instance, the club of compliance officers for SOEs. They can participate in the dialogue with the public authorities. They can identify some areas of our cooperation. They can also participate in pools of interest or in work groups developing the incentives for the enterprises which demonstrate compliance and transparency. As an example, I will tell you about the cooperation with the Ukrenergo. They have been implementing this plan for 2 years, and we offer them our support all the time. They undergo all the checks just like the private business, and according to preliminary assessment, the findings are very positive, and starting from next year, they will become the full-fledged member of our network. We, as the initiative of collective actions, have the accumulated experience, and we offer this experience to the companies. They will not waste the time, and they will be able to implement the action plans as soon as possible. I think that the tools offered by our network will allow the companies to walk through these transformations more smoothly. Of course, there were some non-successful cases. We worked also with companies which do not have supervisory boards yet. Briefly, I will tell you about our plans for future. We are intending to continue development of the programs for enterprises, and tomorrow we, together with the OECD, will participate in an event for the energy enterprises. I think that the long-term cooperation focusing on implementation of recommendations by OECD will bear fruit.
Time for a discussion. I would ask you to pose questions in the chat, and I'll ask the speakers to respond if you have such questions. Because our next panel is already waiting, I'm happy to pass the floor to Lena Pavlenko from the Dixie Group. It's a think tank civil society organization in Ukraine that is very experienced in the energy sector. So thank you very much. We will hopefully discuss in the chat, and please attend the unique training for state-owned enterprises tomorrow and the after tomorrow. Olena, to you.
Thank you very much, Olga. Dear colleagues, please stay with us. We still continue at this discussions. So we have only Ukrainian speakers at our panel. So if you don't mind, I will moderate in Ukrainian. Шановні колеги, отже, ми розпочинаємо панель під назвою «Розслідування та переслідування корупції в енергетичному секторі».
Dear colleagues, we are opening our third panel, namely investigation of corruption violations. The corruption violations rank as second in terms of mentioning in reports of the criminal justice bodies between 2017 and 2010. It is also the second most frequently featured in publications of investigative journalists. Corruption cases, corruption cases are investigated and prosecuted in this sector. They are often high profile. They include very complicated schemes, and usually they last many years. The overview by OECD touches upon many of these cases and allegations. However, the question is also what the criminal justice institutions are doing to detect, investigate, and prosecute corruption in the energy sector. This particular session focuses on the chapter of the review which looks at the investigation and prosecution of corruption in the sector of the justice sector. And I'd like to pass the floor to our senior expert, Mr. Andrei Slusa. He will present the key findings and main recommendations of this chapter. Andrei, over to you. Thank you, Olena. Please let me share my slides. And now I'd like to say that this chapter related to investigation focused on two aspects. First, identification and typologization of most common corruption schemes that are characterized by certain peculiarities in connection with the energy sector. At this stage, we studied the information from the open sources, the information from the Unified Register of pre-trial investigation. We analyzed also some reports by investigative journalists, and as a result, we produced another analytical report that will be presented in a couple of days. And now I would like to dwell briefly on the criminal schemes which we have identified during this analysis. Next slide, please. So during this analysis, we identified the following violations, namely participation of the mediators who get some corruption earnings, then the assets of the company can be used not for the benefit of the enterprises headed by the leadership. The most typical scheme is abuse within the public procurement. And the final group of corruption schemes is abuse of tariffs. It's very difficult to provide evidence for such types of violations. And under these, within these groups of schemes, we identify also subgroups, and the report which I have mentioned covers all types of violations with particular examples of criminal investigations. The part of such cases is still at the stage of investigation, and for some cases, the trials have already begun. Another aspect of our investigation, of our study on investigation and criminal justice, was identification and analysis of some bottlenecks and challenges for investigation, for detection, and bringing the perpetrators to justice. We interviewed the prosecutors' offices, the law enforcement agencies. We developed a SOE, and we also had some working meetings with their respective representatives. Next slide, please. During this analysis, we identified a couple of the priority areas for investigation. First is given a professional opinion. This sphere is very complicated in regulatory terms, and unless the expert opinion is available, it is nearly impossible to investigate into this complicated corruption schemes within the energy sector. However, the qualification of experts is the matter of concern. The experts may be not knowledgeable enough. On the other hand, they may be not utilizing the appropriate methodology, for instance, for estimating the cost of electricity. Another factor of concern is the possible impact on the experts, because the area is conservative, so to say. Everyone has the experience of cooperating with someone, with some expert institutions. So the problem is there. Another problem is related to qualification of private expert institutions. Sometimes they're not willing to conflict with the well-known players, and they avoid giving the contradictory opinions. And the final issue is the cost, because the cost of such services may exceed the budget envisaged by the tender. The choice of potential experts is quite limited, and this increases the risk of exercising certain influence upon them.
And last but not least, this is problems related to carrying out expertises and to identify material losses, economic expertise. Today, according to the guidelines of the Ministry of Justice, experts can ask or even claim to get the results, the conclusions of specialists, the conclusion of experts who have carried out an audit, and then experts, when doing research, they can prove or disprove the conclusions. And that's a problem, because prosecution, they don't have the right to initiate a proceeding, to make a revision during a proceeding, and there is a question related to getting the conclusions of the experts. Matilda, can you please mute yourself? The Criminal Code of Ukraine has a provision which says that expert opinions are used when analyzing. Andrei, I would like to tell that you only have 2 minutes left. Thank you. So I won't dwell on the details of this report. So these are the problems related to the victim status, when the victims do not want to use this right. This is activities to claiming activities on behalf of the enterprises, international cooperation. This is a section which requires additional attention when prosecuting corruption in the energy sector, return on assets as an aspect of investigation, and the aspect of management, taking into account the peculiarities of the energy sector. and regulatory restrictions which are related to criminal responsibility of legal persons, which are related to making agreements. All these risks are detailed in the report. I would just like to ask you to read it. And to end with, I would like to quote several recommendations, which are also there in the report. How to respond to such risks? There are many more of them. However, some of the most important are the following: to strengthen the qualifications of experts, to make sure there is adequate methodology, to increase the opportunity for a wider choice of experts of the required qualification. This is also taking measures to increase the effectiveness of compensation for the enterprises that suffered from corruption, so they are able to properly get back the material losses that they have had. To improve the management of seized assets, take into account the characteristics of the energy sector, because of those assets that, according to the current investigations, are undermanaged, very often are objects of the critical infrastructure, and there are different issues related to those property. Take into account the complexity of the corruption schemes of the energy sector. It is worth to encourage the use of methods to present the most efficient to use the most efficient methods of presenting evidence in court, to use compilation of data, which are contained in the big data sets. So it is useful and efficient for the courts to use. And last but not least, this is the recommendation to expand the list of grounds for the application of criminal law measures against legal entities. As of now, the code, there is practically no criminal corruption offenses in the list in this criminal code of Ukraine, including those in the energy sector. So please don't hesitate to read this report. It contains a lot of information in detail about all the challenges and recommendations which are aimed to make sure that there is adequate response to all those challenges, so we can mitigate the corruption risks. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Andrei. And now I would like to proceed to discussion. And now I would like to give it over to our first participant of the panel, Artem Slidnik, Director of the National Bureau of Investigations. So energy sector and NABU, what are some of the most important cases which are related to systemic problems in the energy sector? And how do you work with those problems? Thank you. Over to you. Hello, dear participants of the conversation. First of all, I would like to thank you for the excellent presentation, for such an in-depth analysis of the problems related to the investigations in the energy sector. I would like to add to that, on behalf of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, that corruption in the energy sector and fighting this corruption has always been the priority of a priority, and not because we were asked to make it a priority. It was just natural. Based on the information that we got from the media and our other sources, it was necessary to take that into account. NABU was created in 2015, and one of the first cases, which was registered in December 2015, was related to the Onishchenko group. I think all of you remember this case, because There were 26 people brought to justice, including MP of Ukraine Onyshchenko and a huge group of people, including the head of the fiscal service of Ukraine. This case was quite simple because back then when the scheme was organized, there were no anti-corruption bureau, there were no NICP, there was no anti-corruption court. The scheme was quite primitive. The gas was bought at lower prices from the state and then sold by real prices through intermediaries to the consumers in the market. And of course, the difference was put into the pockets of those corrupted officials. This scheme was revealed, and all the other cases were more difficult. Those people who organized those schemes, they made conclusions based on the previous investigations, and they always made it more difficult. The next was the case of embezzlement of 600 million hryvnias by the Slidnik Combinat and the Artem. It was related to an organization which was headed by a famous MP. This case is now in court. There were a lot of stuff going on related to this case. There was a lot of pressure. There were a lot of MPs taking part in this, putting pressure on the prosecutor and on the judge. So I won't tell you in detail about all of these cases because it will take a lot of time. There were many of cases like this. Before that, we had almost 400 criminal proceedings related to corruption in the energy sector. 40 of them were brought into court, and there were 80 people brought to responsibility. There are real sentences in relation to the head of the Khersonsky thermal power plant. Total losses amount to 4 billion hryvnias. Some of the cases are still waiting. For example, a case related to Rotterdam Plus, almost 4 billion hryvnias in losses. All of these numbers prove that the corruption in the energy sector is very high. And just by investigating those cases, we won't be able to reach significant changes. I fully agree with the conclusions made. We always have problems with the pressure on the experts. But if we take a deeper look at the reasons behind all of those corruption risks, I would say that the reason is that many players of the market in the energy sector have a monopoly. So there is a passivity of the anti-monopoly committee. Because of that, they have a huge influence over many sectors. So a couple of examples. When we investigated the case Rotterdam Plus, depending on who was in power, the anti-monopoly committee had one opinion. After the authorities changed, they reviewed the same materials and had another opinion. So if you don't take more measures, administrative measures, to make sure that there is a decrease in the anti-corruption risks in the energy sector, we won't be able to achieve positive results in preventing and combating corruption in the energy sector. And of course, every case which was investigated by NABU, together with the Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, I cannot tell you about the number of petitions which I filed to the Prime Minister of Ukraine, which were related to corruption risks, but there were no adequate measures to remove those corruption risks. We just received formal answers because we suppose that some prime ministers were somehow related to those risks, or they had indirect relations which prevented them from making adequate decisions to combat corruption in this area. That is why those problems that were raised during the previous presentations, I would like to say that there is those problems are ignored on behalf of our government. I am ready to show you the number of petitions and requests which we've sent to the government, and I can show you the answers we got to them. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Artem. Our next speaker is Maxim Hroshchuk, acting head of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine. Maxim, same question to you. Yes, we can hear you. Everything is okay. Over to you now. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me here. There were a lot of important questions raised that we face every day in our daily practice. The previous speaker raised a lot of important issues. They're quite typical. I would like to say that they are not only typical to the energy sector, but typical to most cases which are related to the state ownership. At least those cases which we investigate are related to corruption. So these problems are classic. As for the energy sector, it has several characteristics which I would like to enumerate. I won't tell you in detail about the cases. Let me tell you about the recent ones which were brought into court this year. As an example, there was a mine which received money for works that it hasn't done. It has done, however, the directors of this mine using intermediaries, they included other smaller companies that were mentioned as contractors. So the state money went to those enterprises that didn't make anything. There were more than 6 million hryvnias that was embezzled because of this scheme. This is not only typical for the energy sector. I think this is typical of most state-owned enterprises that we investigate. And we also have a proceeding related to the electricity. There were abuses or manipulations of civil relations when, for example, an enterprise shall pay the money for energy consumed to a special account, and then there will be energy redistributed. Instead of that, a state enterprise using other intermediaries, the final consumer had to pay the money to this account, which would distribute the electricity. Instead of that, they pay for the account of the third parties, which are involved in a scheme to embezzle the money from consumers. So this is an abuse, a violation of the legislation in this area. So this is a peculiarity of the energy sector in Ukraine. As for the other proceedings that we have right now, this is so-called preferential tariff. There was a case related with the gas for consumers, where there was a particular price for consumers and another price for enterprises, for industry. So people get the gas at the preferential tariffs, and enterprises, including those which use gas to generate electricity, they pay at a higher price. So enterprises or people who have access to those resources with the aim to provide this thermal energy for the population. They used this gas to generate energy, to sell it at the state market at higher prices. So this is just an example where there is no efficient control. Then there are such conditions which shall be investigated by NICP and NABU. I also agree with the previous speaker who said that there is a problem with experts. With expertise, it is quite difficult to find proper experts. They are busy or they simply don't exist. And there are a lot of problems related to public procurement. As for other cases, so I've just told you about the most prominent cases. If there is no response from the state, then we will have the same investigations or the same proceedings, but in relation to other people or groups of people. When a group of people will get access to state budget at state enterprises, they will create their own enterprises, which will buy oil and gas at a lower price. They will create an artificial market, artificial competition, and then later they will sell those resources at market prices at a different exchange at double the price. And the state doesn't get anything for that. So this is also a huge problem of the state-owned enterprises, and it needs to be taken into account. That's it. To sum up, I would like to say that we don't have priorities, top priorities set right now, but this is one of the those investigations require a lot of resources, and we also have a lot of cases in this area. There are a lot of episodes of corruption with involvement of many people. That is why we use a lot of resources.
So these are really time and cost-intensive proceedings. Hopefully in that next year, we will see the first verdicts, but it's just our hope, of course. Thank you very much. In fact, our panel should have been much longer because here we're discussing particular schemes and particular violations, given very interesting examples. We have already mentioned the Anti-Monopoly Committee, the response from the government, cooperation with the governmental authorities, the issue of the prevention of corruption violations, the issue of cooperation between all the authorities in order to prevent such abuse and violations. Now, let me pass the thought to Mr. Ivan Lakhtionov, the Deputy Director on Innovative Projects from Transparency International. Mr. Ivan, please offer the opinion from the point of view of the civil society, but you have no more than 3 minutes, unfortunately. Thank you. In fact, you are right. I am in charge of a Dozoro project, and I also cover the issue of public procurement. I think that public procurement is an eternal issue, and the corruption will always accompany the procurements, and not only in the energy sector. So happy to be another speaker in this panel, together with many other distinguished participants. And the role of, I'd like to say that the role of civil society, CSOs, is really crucial. Sometimes it's even more important or more influential than the role of some public institutions. But here I imply not only the CSOs, but also the journalists, in particular investigative journalists, who make their important contribution. Thus, we arrived at the conclusion that the role of the investigative journalists and CSOs is highly essential, and we as CSOs are able to offer a range of specific tools such as the Dozoro project. There is also the module of public analysis. I'm sure it's in use by the controlling authorities, in particular those who spoke today, because there are no alternatives and no alternatives in terms of analytical tools applied to the assessment of procurement. So I'm urging you to be active, to be proactive, to be to file petitions, because it's not enough to discuss the issues of treason on FB. It's crucial to focus on some priorities, because definitely the anti-corruption authorities are overwhelmed. So we have to monitor and channel the petitions or various requests in terms of anti-corruption actions. We have to be really aware and to do everything in order to avoid of the violations. Today, we see that we see some cases in terms of public procurement that minimize the competition on the market, because we know that the best controlling entity is the competitor. The competitor usually know best what the violations are about. But today, in the sphere of procurement, we see a general trend. Procurement procedure is believed to be something unnecessary, and thus we face with cases such as construction of airports based on no tenders, or reconstruction of the Okruzhna road in the accelerated mode. We know also about some plans to construct power plants with no fair competition. You can imagine the amount of these contracts. This trend is the source of concern. And another example, quite recently, the Security Service of Ukraine started investigating the case of 20 million abuse or embezzlement at the construction of a hydropower plant in Khmelnytsky. Of course, we are all looking forward to the fulfillment of promises given to us previously. However, Ukraine still is making some progress, although slow. The anti-corruption authorities are in place, and we still need to reinforce the role of anti-monopoly committee. I agree with the previous speakers who said that anti-monopoly committee poses a big problem. 1 minute. Anti-monopoly committee recently started investigation together with NABO, the case related to the procurement of equipment costing up to 100 million hryvnias, and some energy enterprise, Atom, was involved into this case. It was one of the companies that procured this equipment. So the total abuse amounts to 100 million hryvnias. At the same time, there is some progress. The anti-corruption court has made a number of verdicts. Of course, I would like this number to be higher. Generally, we at the Transparency International studied some of the authorities whose representatives have spoken today, and we are always ready to exchange our opinions and to provide some support. At the same time, these authorities also are open to cooperation, of course, under the effective legislation, because they are not able to disclose more than allowed by the laws. Thank you, dear panelists. Thank you for your particular examples, and especially we highly appreciate that you were brief and concise. Today, our goal was to discuss all possible issues related to anti-monopoly committee, to the response of the government, resources, transparency, and the need for prevention. So that's what we have done, actually. With that, I have to finalize the session. Unfortunately, we do not have enough time for Q&A session. But
Я вибачаюсь, якраз от
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. Artem, you've got 30 seconds. The High Anti-Corruption Court has just made a decision on appointment of the head of anti-corruption prosecutor's office. Now we have the grounds for being optimistic. Thank you. With that, let me pass the floor to the OECD representative for the final remarks.
Mathilde, are you with us? Mathilde Menard?
Yes, I'm just putting
okay, there we are.
Off. Sorry.
Please.
Yes.
Carry on.
Thank you, William. And dear ladies and gentlemen, and dear colleagues, it's really my pleasure, as usual, to be with you in Ukraine somehow, even only virtually, to close this event and to thank you all, alongside Minister Nemchinov, to thank our speakers and our participants for sharing your time and, most importantly, your expertise with us in addressing this very important issue. And I'd like again here to thank the Government of Norway for its support, financial and political support, and to thank our Ukrainian colleagues for their excellent collaboration. So this review, anti-corruption review of the energy sector in Ukraine, plays a very important part in the OECD's broader efforts to support key reforms in the Ukrainian energy sector. And as you have seen, it analyzes the operations of 34 state institutions involved in the energy sector, and it touches upon the functioning of the top state-owned enterprises in oil and gas, in nuclear power, is in hydropower, in coal energy, and also in renewables. It then puts these findings into a broader context of state policies, of international commitments and non-governmental initiatives in the energy sector in Ukraine, and all of which, as you know, involve multiple partners in the international community, but also in the civil society and in the business. So all of this would not have been possible without all of your contribution and engagement. The most important part of the report is contained obviously in the recommendations, and many of them are ambitious, and most of them will require serious undertakings on the side of our Ukrainian partners. And as we heard from our experts today, key areas for reform include, first, ensuring that state-owned enterprises are managed professionally, accountably, and responsibly according to global standards, such as the OECD State-owned Enterprise Guidelines for corporate governance and the Anti-Corruption and Integrity Guidelines for State-owned enterprise. Linked to this is the importance of having an open and competitive privatization process in the sector, as well as proper public procurement, licensing, and permits. And we also discussed the broader challenges of strengthening Ukraine's anti-corruption legal and regulatory framework, and most importantly, its enforcement including in the energy sector. So the review has already generated great interest as we received comments from over 20 institutions in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. And we really look forward to this review being read and most importantly, being used by the wider public as we work on the improvement of policies and at the end, improvement of quality of life in our countries, including, of course, in this case, in Ukraine. So we at the OECD, we really stand ready to build on the success of this exercise, this review, and to continue to support Ukraine in implementing these recommendations. The effective implementation of these anti-corruption reforms is critical to the overall success of the OECD project on supporting energy sector reform in Ukraine, as the energy sector of Ukraine can only be efficient and can only be sustainable if corruption is effectively addressed. So with that, I thank you again for your time, energy, and expertise, and I wish you a very good evening and wish you a very happy New Year. Minister, you have the floor now, I think.
Minister Nemchinov, please, we have the honor of hearing now from the Minister for the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine.
Доброго дня, Ваша Високоповажності, пане Шлагенхауф, шановна пані.
Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues. Let me commend you on the successful presentation of the anti-corruption overview of the energy sector in Ukraine. Hopefully, this discussion has been interesting and it has become an additional incentive for the development of energy sector regulation. I think that recommendations from this overview will become a useful tool for these SOEs and public organizations, which will use it for studying various challenges the energy sector is experiencing at the moment. This overview encompasses both global practices and particular examples and cases, including negative ones. The overview hopefully will allow to bring the cooperation between the government of Ukraine and OECD to a new level. In this respect, let me also mention the fifth round of the implementation of Istanbul Action Plan for the Eastern Europe and Central Asia. We expect that the results of monitoring will be published next year and will be used for improvement of anti-corruption actions in Ukraine. Based upon the results of the monitoring, we will be working on building on the investment capacity. I would like to thank the Government of Norway for the support of this project, and hopefully we will enjoy further cooperation. This cooperation is highly important for our government. We keep moving towards further approximation. Cooperation with OECD is the part of the broader European integration context for our state. We are focusing on the rule of law and implementation of the European Union standards. The standards and recommendations will become the basis or will inform our decisions in terms of the policy. Thank you for this cooperation, and hopefully further cooperation will produce even greater results that will benefit the lives of our citizens. Looking forward to new projects. Thank you for your attention and happy holidays.
Thank you.
3 very intensive hours of discussion, very important work. I don't want to prolong this myself, except to endorse and repeat all of the thanks we've heard to our Ukrainian partners and colleagues, to Norway for supporting this work. We're grateful also to many other donors who support OECD work with Ukraine. I thank all of the participants for their interest and concern with these issues. And finally, we mustn't finish without thanking the individuals who probably have worked harder this afternoon than anyone else involved in this webinar. So I hope you will join me in thanking the interpreters who've done an outstanding job in allowing us to have a rich and substantive dialogue across a linguistic divide. So with that, I think we are done. I thank you all. I wish you all wonderful holidays for the end of the year and a bright start to 2022.
Thank you.